A key skill for backend web development is learning how to build a REST API, and that's what we'll do today with Python and Flask. Hello and welcome, I'm Dave. Today we'll use Python and Flask to build a REST API, and I'll provide links to all resources in the description below. Hi, Dave here, and I'm excited to be back and creating another Python tutorial for my channel. I plan to continue creating Python tutorials along with all of the other topics that I cover on my channel. And I need to hear from you, so remember to give a thumbs up and leave a comment about what topics you would like to see me cover in the future. Today we're going to build a REST API with Python and Flask. Now, if you haven't used Python before, I have a free Python course available on my channel that you can check out, and I'll put a link to that in the description, and there should be a link to it on the screen right now. So let's start by doing a quick review of the initialisms that we use when we say REST API. I'm on the Mozilla web page where it has some definitions about web development and all things development, really. MDN is what we usually call it. And you can see I'm on a page for REST, and it says REST stands for Representational State Transfer. That's a mouthful for sure. And overall, you can dive in and get a lot of deep detail here, but what I just want to highlight is it says beginners can assume a REST API means an HTTP service. So that is one that we would access through our browser, for example, by going to a URL that starts with HTTP, and usually HTTPS these days, meaning it's secure. And after that, it says that can be called using standard web libraries and tools. Well, a standard tool is a browser. So we can call a REST API simply by going to a URL and requesting data from it. And although this initialism means representational state transfer, one way I like to think about a REST API is that it's simply not doing anything. It's resting until I contact it and ask for information. Now, I've already been using the second initialism, which is API. So let's look at that page as well. Now, an API, or the initialism API, stands for Application Programming Interface. Again, you could do a deep dive, but what I want to focus on is that this sentence, the API, can be seen as a simple contract. In other words, the interface between the application offering it and something like a third-party software application, which would be like a web application running in the browser. So any front-end web app can request data from a REST API and receive that data back. So the REST API is the interface. So now we've covered both initialisms, REST and API, and put together, they offer a service on the web where you can request information from them, and we request that information through HTTP endpoints, so URLs that we send a request to and we receive data back from. Let's look at how all of that works with a quick diagram. Okay, we're looking at the diagram now, and you can see I've got a browser over here on the left, and it's going to request data from an endpoint, and that endpoint is whatever.com/API/users. So it's going to request users data about the users, for example. Just an example, it could be anything, to-dos, posts, whatever. And the typical method we would send from a browser would be the get method, but there are other methods as well. We send post when we actually want to post new data, we send put or patch when we want to update data, and we send delete when we want to delete data. Now, you may have heard of those different methods. They're called CRUD methods, which stands for create, read, update, and delete, but the HTTP methods that go with them aren't the exact same words. So get is the read, post is the create, update is usually put or patch, and delete is actually delete. So our browser, in this example, sends a request to the server, and then the server processes that request with the REST API. That's where we'll be running our Python code, and it may need to get some data from a database even, and then it gets that data back, and it sends the response, the data that we requested. And so that's a simple look at a REST API. Okay, I've got Visual Studio Code open, which is what I'm going to use for a code editor today. And you can see I've created a new folder called Flask-API, and I've got that folder open. It's empty right now. Now, the first thing that I do in any Python project is create a virtual environment. Now, I should say at this point, if you don't have Python installed, you have skipped past my advice of going to my Python for Beginners course. So if you're not familiar with Python, going to get a little left behind. I really recommend that beginner's course. But once you've gone through that, we have done this in the beginner's course, and that is create a virtual environment. So I'm going to open up the terminal window with Control and the backtick. Now, a couple of things to note here. I'm using Windows, so some Mac and Linux commands could be just a little different. I'll tell you the ones that I know for sure. Also, I'm using the git bash terminal here. I'm not using PowerShell on Windows. So if you install Git, and of course if you work with Git and GitHub, you should have git bash. If not, the PowerShell commands may be just a little different. What I'm going to start off with is typing pi, and this is one of the differences between Windows and Mac and Linux. I just need to type pi. If you're on Mac or Linux, you probably need to type Python and the number 3 after it to call that. Then I'm going to say -m for module, and I'm using the virtual environment module. Then I just want to create our virtual environment in this folder, which is a standard name for it, .venv. Press enter. It should now create a virtual environment folder for you over here in your file tree. And as soon as that's finished, we can activate it. And this is where there's some differences too. I know for a fact activating a virtual environment in PowerShell is just a little bit different than using git bash. Git bash is very much like using Mac or Linux with just a few differences. So I'll tell you both the same. On Windows and Mac and Linux, we'd type source. Then after that, we're going to type .venv/. Now this is where it's different. If you're on Mac or Linux, you just type bin with lowercase. On Windows, you type scripts with a capital S. Then after that, activate on either one, Mac, Linux, or Windows. Now I'll just press enter. This will activate our virtual environment, and you can see the .venv in parentheses here after that, so you know it has been activated. And if I press enter one more time, it will then shortly afterwards show me this .venv. I'm not sure why I'm getting some of this right now, but I recently did a VS Code update, and maybe that's part of the reason. So I'm not for sure, but you should definitely see the parentheses and .venv. This part has nothing to do with that. And I'll quickly mention, anytime you want to deactivate, you just type deactivate and press enter, and that will deactivate the virtual environment. Now that we have our virtual environment running, we need to install a few dependencies. The first one is Flask, and we do the dependencies, or we install the dependencies with pip. So I'm going to say pip install, and I want Flask. And we'll let that install. It looks like I'm also getting a message here that I could upgrade pip if I want to. I'm not going to right now, it's very close, but I could do that in the future. And with Flask installed, we're also going to use Flask, I need the word install, and we're going to use Flask _Restful, which is going to help us create a REST API. We could do it without that, but this will make things a little bit easier. It has some nice features. Then after this finishes, we also need pip install, and then I want Flask _SQL, stands for SQL Alchemy, and that is our ORM that we're going to use. And ORM is another initialism. It stands for Object Relational Mapping. It's what we'll use to talk to the database from our Python code. Okay, with all three of those installed, now it's a good idea to create a requirements.txt file. So I'm going to type pip freeze, and then I'm going to have a greater than sign, and I want requirements.txt. This is going to create a requirements.txt file that's going to show all of the dependencies that we've installed. And you'll see some listed that we didn't actually type install for, that may be another package like Flask needed. So now we see the requirements.txt over here. Let's quickly look at that. Now this will be included in my GitHub source code, the completed source code. So you could actually use the requirements.txt to install the dependencies from. That's what it's for. So when you're sharing the source code to a project, everyone knows what dependencies are needed. So after I create a requirements.txt, I also like to create a git ignore. So I'm going to say touch.gitignore, should create a git ignore file. And I'm going to list the .venv folder in there and save that file, because that is a folder that we don't need to send to GitHub. You would create your own virtual environment on your computer, even if you're using my source code. And as I mentioned, you could install all of those dependencies if you downloaded my source code. You could just use that requirements.txt. So you would type pip install, 2 L's there, -r, and then requirements.txt. that would install all of the dependencies listed in my requirements.txt file. Now clearly I don't need to do that, so I'll just delete that out, and I'm going to close the terminal window, and let's get started building our REST API. So let's create a file over here, and we'll call this one api.py. So we'll start by bringing in Flask, so I'll say from Flask, import Flask with a capital F. Then I'll go down a couple lines and say app equals, and I want Flask, and in parentheses, I want 2 underscores, name, and 2 more underscores. Now after that, let's create our first route, and this would be where we would request data from with our browser. And in this example, we're going to just send back a simple web page first, but in the future, we're going to send JSON data and not a web page. So here I'm going to say @app.route, and I'm just going to pick the home page route, which would be a slash. So it's the slash that comes after whatever.com. Now, after I've defined the route, I need a function that runs after this route. I'm going to say def, I'll just call this home because it's for the home page. Then here, we're going to return something, and I'm just going to return an H1 here that says Flask REST API. Close out that H1, that's HTML. But it's not going to run yet, so we need to put something in here that will actually get our server to run. So now I'm going to say if 2 underscores name 2 underscores equals 2 whoops, not dashes, 2 underscores main 2 underscores. Now we'll run this code. And this would just be app.run, and let's go ahead and set debug equal to true, which we should get a message once this starts running that it will remind us never to do that in production. But when we're in development, it's good to have debug equal to true. So now let's open up a terminal window once again, and I'm just going to type py and then api.py to run our file. And yes, it starts running at 127.0.0.1, which is local host when you're in development. Then it's at port 5000. I'm just going to hold down the control button and click that right here, and it should launch in the browser. And when I go to the browser, now we see this simple web page with the H1 that says Flask REST API. So we know our server is up and running. But wow, that is bright. So I want to get away from that web page. And we're not typically going to access everything through our web page like that. I just wanted to give that example to get everything up and running. Now, one nice thing about debug mode that we're currently running the app in is as we make changes, it will restart. So we don't have to always start it like that. But you can see we need to press Control-C to quit if we ever want to quit. Now let's add SQL Alchemy to our program, and eventually we'll create our database with it. So we'll start by saying from Flask underscore SQL Alchemy, then we want to import SQL Alchemy, and notice the capital letters there at the beginning of SQL Alchemy at the end. After that, we need to set a config here as well. So we'll say app.config. Now we need brackets, and here in all caps, it's SQL Alchemy underscore, we want database underscore URI. So we're saying where the database is going to be. And we'll say equals, put in single quotes is fine here, SQLite, because we're using a SQLite database. Now we want 3 slashes, not 2, but 3. And then we'll put database.db. So we're naming our SQLite database, the file, database.db. Now we need one more line, so I'm going to say db equals, and here I'm going to say SQL Alchemy, and I'm going to pass in app. But before we can create the database, we also need to model our data, so the database knows the shape of the data that it's going to be storing, and will be interacting with that with our SQL Alchemy ORM. So we'll put that here on another line. We'll start off with class user model, because we're going to store user data. Now here we'll say db.model. Now inside of this class, I'm going to set the different values. So the first one is ID. Every entry will have an ID. db column. And we'll start off with db integer. So this will be a number. And then it's also going to be the primary key. So we set that equal to true. Now I'm going to press Shift, Alt, and the down arrow to just copy that down, but I'm going to change some things now. So this next one is going to be name. You could call it username if you want, but I'm going to use name, so maybe stick with that here to start off with. Then we'll have string, and I'm going to say this could have 80 characters. This is not going to be a primary key, but I am going to say it needs to be unique. That would be true. So much like a username, we would expect those to be unique. Also put nullable equals false. Then I'm going to once again Shift Alt and the down arrow. And I'm going to switch this one over to email. Now email has all of the same settings really. It can be a string with 80 characters, unique is true, nullable false. So that's our data, but we're not quite finished with the class. We also need a representation down here. So I'm just going to say def 2 underscores REPR and then 2 more underscores. And then I want to pass in self. Now this should represent the data. It should be a string. So I want to return an F string. And then inside of this, I'm going to say user in parentheses. Then I'll have name equals, here I'll say self dot name and have a comma. Then I'll say email equals, and not parentheses, but curly brackets here, and then self dot name once again. So that represents the data. We don't need the ID there. We expect every database entry to have an ID. So what we're really representing is the user with name and email. And now that we've created our data model, let's save this file, and we want to create a new file over here, and I'm going to call this create_db.py. Now I'll say from API, which is our other file there, we'll import the app and db. Now on the next line, we'll say app.app_context. You can see that right there. Put parentheses after it. And underneath this, I'm going to say db.create all, and that also needs parentheses. And it looks like I left the with off, so I got in just a bit of a hurry, but I want to say with app.app_context db create all. This will actually create the database. So let's save and open the terminal window. Now in this window, I'm just going to say py create_db.py. Now this should create our database, and it will put it in a folder named instance. So you see that right over here already. I'll close the terminal again. We open up instance, we should see our database.db file. Hey, I hope you're enjoying the video. You may be surprised to learn that 3 out of every 4 viewers, nearly 75% of everyone that watches a video on my channel, is not subscribed. So I just wanted to take a quick second and remind you to hit that subscribe button if you haven't. It really helps out. Now back to the video. With that in place, we can close the create_db file, and we're ready to add that last dependency now. So we'll say from Flask _Restful, we want to import, and there's several things here. We want resource, we want API, we want rec, stands for request, parse, we want fields, we'll also go with marshal_with, and the word abort, so we can also abort a request. So several things there, and if I press Alt-Z, it's going to wrap that down to the next line. So the VS Code will change all of these, of course, as we use them. It'll change these to a brighter color like we see here. Right now, we can visually tell that none of these are being used yet. Now, after all of those imports, all we need to do is come down on this next line after DB. Let's say API equals, and we'll use API and pass in app. Now you can see this API up here has changed colors, but now we have defined our API with Flask Restful by setting it right here on line 8. The next import we're going to use is this RequestParser, and we're going to use that to define some arguments that are going to come in. When we want to send data to our API and create new users, we're going to need to validate that data to make sure it's what we expect, and we can do that with the RequestParser. So here I'm going to call these user_args. I'm going to set this equal to that RequestParser dot RequestParser and call that. Let me get an extra line there, and I'll scroll up just a little bit. So now on this next line, I can say user_args dot add_argument. Now I'm going to add an argument for the first value that we expect to get, which is a name. We can say it is a type equal to string. It is required, so we can set that, required with a D there, equal to true. And finally, we can offer some help. So we'll say help equals, say name cannot be blank. And now we want something very similar for email. So once again, I'm going to use Shift Alt and the down arrow, copy that down, change name here to email, and I'll also change the help to email cannot be blank. So now we have set up the user args that we expect to get, and we can use these inside of the functions that we're going to call when we receive requests. And now we're ready to set up our first endpoint other than this first one that we already did for the home route that sends the HTML. This one will actually send some data. Let's start off by saying class users. Now we'll pass in resource that we should have imported above as well. Now inside of this user's resource, we're going to say def, now say get. Now this is the HTTP method get that is going to come in. Pass in self here. Here we'll say users equals user model dot query dot all. So we're retrieving all of the users from the database. Now of course we don't have any there yet, so it should just be an empty array. Now we're going to return users. So this has defined our first endpoint, but we haven't assigned it yet. So we need to assign that to a URL. So we can do that with api.add_resource. Now we can provide first the class, which is users, and then we can say this is going to be available at /API/users, and we'll go ahead and put a slash after that as well. So now when we send a GET request to our whatever.com/API/users, then we should get all of the users returned to us. Just to see if this is working, let's go ahead and open up the terminal, and we'll go ahead and start the API once again. So I'll say py api.py and confirm that it is running on our local host at port 5000. Now I'll control click to open that up once again. And this should be, once again, that bright white screen. But now let's change the URL and go to /API/users. And you can barely see it over here, but I did get a very small empty array in the corner of the browser. And that is what I expected to get. Back in VS Code, now that we've got an empty array, that's not what we want at all. We want JSON data, not HTML, not an empty array. And we have to do just a little bit more work to get that data. It's going to be serialized data that is sent back to us, whether it's a browser or we're using a REST API client, which we're going to use here in just a moment to test some of these. So let's go ahead and set that up. And we need to start off with some definitions here for the user fields. So I'm going to say user fields equals, now it's going to have an ID. And then we imported fields above, so we can say fields.integer. After that, we're going to have the name, and this is going to be fields.string. And once again, I can shift alt and the down arrow because email is also a string, and just change this to email. Now, if you're familiar with JSON data, that's exactly what this looks like. It's in the curly braces. We've got a key over here on the left, and the shape of the data on the right, whether it's an integer or string or possibly some other type. But those are the types that we have. So that's what we're expecting to send back when we send data as well. But now notice I said serialized JSON or serialized data. We can do that with our Flask RESTful API, where we imported up here Marshall with, one of the only two we haven't used yet. So Marshall with is a decorator, and that helps us send that JSON back in a serialized format. So now if we scroll down here to our class users resource, we're going to decorate this get function with Marshall with. And we decorate with the @ symbol, we have Marshall with, and then inside of this, we're going to say user fields. So we're telling it the shape of the data that we defined up here. We're going to do this for each of our functions, for our HTTP methods that are sending data back, like our GET request right here that sends all of the users. So every user should have this shape. Now I would test this, but we don't have any data in the database yet to test it with. So let's go ahead and also add a post request function here in our resource, and then we'll be able to submit some data, add that data to our database, and then request it and get that data back. I'm going to scroll up just a little bit, and now that we're scrolled up, let's go ahead and start our post function. And I could just copy line 29 because it also needs to be decorated with the Marshall with decorator. So there it is. Now I'll say def post, and we're going to pass in self here as well. Now remember those args, the user args we could get? Let's call them args here and set this equal to user underscore args dot parse underscore args. and it will parse those arguments with the definitions that we set right up here. So now we expect to receive a name and an email when we're creating a new user. So there we'll say user equals user model. Now we'll say name equals args, and then in brackets we could say name, and we should have a comma here next, and then email equals args brackets email. So if this doesn't parse correctly, right here it's going to send back a response saying something was wrong. So we don't really need to worry about that. But the very next line, we're creating the user right here from the arguments. So now that we've got the user, on the next line we can say db session.add and pass in the user. So now we've added the user to the session, db session.commit, and commit that. And now we can get the data that we want to send back. We've already added our new user. So here we'll say users equals user model dot query dot all, and then we'll return users. And now we can set a status here. Your default status for a successful request is 200, but 201 means created. So we want to send a HTTP status of 201. So we just put a comma and provide that new status number right there. Okay, with these changes in place, we are ready to test it out. So let's once again open up the terminal, and it looks like everything is running as expected. Yeah, it all seems good. So restarting here, debugger is active. Everything's good there. Now, what are we going to test it out with? We can't just post data through the URL bar in our browser. I'm going to use an extension called Thunder Client. You may have heard of another one called Postman. There are several different extensions or programs you can test REST APIs with. So in VS Code, if you go to extensions, if you search for Thunder Client, it should come up, and I've already got it installed. It's right here, so mine's already running, and I'll be able to pull that up. So this is the extension I'm going to use in this tutorial if you want to use the same one. If not, you could look for Postman. I highly recommend it as well. Now that I have Thunder Client, let me find it over here. There's Thunder Client, so I clicked my dots. Now I could set a new request. I'll just go here for now. Is that localhost? Yep, that's what I want. So our terminal says we're running at 127.0.0.1. That's the same as localhost. Got port 5000, but I don't have the right address here. We put it at API/users. So right now, if we send a GET request to API users, you could just ignore the body here because it doesn't really matter what we're sending there. We have no query params, any of this stuff. We just need a GET request like the browser would send to API/users. We should get an empty array here. We've just got the brackets, and it was a 200 response. That's what we want. And now let's send some data. So we'll choose post. That should match the post function we set. And we're still going to the same address, API/users. So now let's go to the body here, and you can see I have in a name Irvin and an email. This is some data I had from JSON placeholder before. If you ever go to that website, it has some nice fake data there. So let's post Irvin as a user and see what we get back. A 201 created. Our new user was created, and now we've got all of the user data back, which is just an array with one user in it so far. But we can easily create another one. So I'll just put in my name, Dave. And then for email, go ahead and put in my dave@davegray.codes. Add that one in as well. It's created. So now I'll drag this up. Now when we got all of the user data back, we got both users. Let's go ahead and add one more. Let's add Leanne, and I can't remember the fake email address. We'll just put in one. We'll say fake@emailfake.com. And enter that. Let's see if we've got all three. Yes, we do have all three now. So the response when we create a user is to send back all of the user data, just as if we went to get and requested all of that user data here. Now we've got the 200, and we've got all of that user data back as well. Both endpoints for our users are working. But one thing we didn't test was sending some bad data that our RequestParser would check. So let's go back to the post request now, go to API users, that's the same. Now let's send a blank name, or let's just remove the name from what we're sending here. I'm just going to cut it out with Control X. I'll send this in, and yep, 400 bad request. And here's our help. Name cannot be blank. Okay, so let's put name back, and let's go ahead and take out email. Let's do the same thing. Bad request, email cannot be blank. So yep, our request parser is also working as expected. I'm going to go back to our api.py file now and the regular file tree over here. And while our class users resource here has a get and a post, what if I just want to request one user, or I want to update one user, or delete one user? Well, let's set up another class resource for that also. So underneath here, I'm going to say class user, and I'm going to scroll so we have a little more room. This is going to be a resource just like users was. Now inside of this, I could also just scroll a little bit more where I could copy something to save some time here. I'll get the Marshall with user fields and paste it right underneath because it is identical. And then we're going to have a def, and once again, it's a get request just to get one user. But it's going to receive not only self, but also the ID of the user. Now that we have that request, we can say user equals user model.query.filter. So we need to filter, oh, it's actually filter underscore by. We need to filter by the ID. So where ID equals ID, because that's also what's being passed in, and we can say dot first. So the first one it finds that matches. There should only be one, but that makes sense. But this is where we'll use the abort that we brought in. That's the only thing we hadn't used yet. So we'll say if not user, meaning if it doesn't find the user doesn't exist, then we'll say abort. And now inside this abort function, we can pass a status 404, meaning not found. And now we'll say user not found as the message that gets sent back. Okay, let me scroll just a little more for room. We'll come back over because we're not quite finished yet. If we do find the user, we want to return that user. But we're also not ready to test yet until we add the resource. We've got a resource here for users, but not for our user. So let's go ahead and add that resource as well, api.addResource. Now it's user with a capital U. Now this is going to go to a slightly different URL because it's /API/users once again. We could send it anywhere, but this is where I'm going to send it. Now we need to specify that parameter that we get in the URL, which is the ID. So int, because it's an integer, a number, and then we say the name of it, which is ID. So the name here needs to match what's going into the function. Okay, so now we've set up our second resource, and we can test that out as well with our GET request. So let's go back. Now let's go ahead and add an ID. Remember, we have 1, 2, 3 users, right? So let's request user number 3. Not a post though, it's a GET. Send that, and now we've got user number 3 back. Notice it's not an array, it's just the user here inside of curly brackets. And that would change if we request user 2, we would get the ID of 2. Okay, let's go back and quickly set up the edit and delete as well, so we will complete all of our CRUD operations. Now these will all be for the user resource. So now I'm going to copy Git and do Shift Alt and the down arrow and just copy all of that down, and we can change what we need to change, add what we need to add. So I'm going to use a patch method here. Okay, so after we get self and ID here, we're going to get args once again, because remember, we're sending some data in now to update with. So we could scroll back up here and get those user args again. I can copy that with Control C, come back down and put it right under our patch as the function starts out. After we have that, we're going to get that specific user. So this line doesn't need to change. We're still filtering by ID and getting the first one. And this line doesn't need to change either. If the user is not found, this is the same response. But now we do need to update the database if we find the user. So here we're going to say user.name equals args, have our bracket, and then quote and name. Now I will Shift Alt and the down arrow to copy that and just switch name and Control D to select both instances of that and just type email. So now I've updated the username and the user email. but I haven't committed it yet. So now I need to say db session commit, and that will commit that change to the database. And then let's just return the updated user. Okay, now let's quickly do the same thing for delete. So I'll scroll up a little bit, highlight all of our patch, and do Shift Alt and the down arrow, and it will just copy it. I'll put a line in between. Once again, we need the marshal with and the user fields. Instead of patch, this is going to be delete, and it's going to receive self and the ID. We're not going to receive any new user arguments though, so we don't need that. Now we can look for the user, and if we don't find the user, it's still user not found. Once again, we don't need the user args here. Then after this, we do need a different line for the DB to delete. So we say db.session.delete, and we pass in the user that was found, so we're deleting that. Then we commit our changes. Now let's go ahead and send all of the users back. So this is the same line we used when we retrieved all of the users here, but it's going to be a little bit different because we will not have created a new user. I'm going to these from the post, paste these in. So we've got all of the users we're sending back as a response, and it should not contain the one we deleted. But then when we return those users, we want to send a 204, which will say, yes, we actually did successfully delete the user we intended to. And okay, let's test both of these out. I'm going to go back to Thunder Client. Now we're once again at the URL that's identifying individual users. So I'm going to say user 3 here, and now we're going to choose patch to update the user. And what I want to do is change this email. I'm going to say Leanna works at davegray.codes also. So here we'll say Leanna at davegray.codes. So we'll be updating her email address. Let's see how this works out when we send our patch request. It says it was updated. So there's ID 3, Leanna, and her new email. So that's what we expected. Let's just go ahead and request all users now instead of an individual user, and make sure we're seeing everything we expect to see there. So in here we've got Irvin, Dave, and Leanna, and we've got the updated email there. So that's all good. Now let's go ahead and delete Irvin. So we want to back here and say /1, choose delete, and really that's all we need to do. It doesn't matter what's in the body. It's not expecting to receive any of those user args. So let's send this now. And we've got a 204, no content, but we didn't get any content either. So maybe we want to change that status because it's still legitimate to go ahead and just send a 200 response, and that should send the actual data back and still say it was successfully deleted. So let's go ahead and try that again, and we might not have that user though. So if I come back, let's get all users and see what users we have. Yes, it was successfully deleted, but we just had that other status. So let's test this out again by deleting Leanna. Say users /3, go to delete, send that. And now we've got a 200 response and we got all the users back, but the only user is me. So we don't have a whole lot of users, I guess I should say, but it does work as expected now. So 200 is the correct response that is set there by default when we want to return user data. If we weren't returning any user data at all, a 204 would be just fine. All right, guys, congrats on completing the REST API. If this was your first one, it's a big step. Now, notice I didn't use to-do data or post data when we did this tutorial, and that's often the case for tutorials like this. However, I chose to use user data. Notice one thing though, when we did the data validation with RequestParser, we were just able to say the email should not be blank. Now, if you'd like to see a tutorial in the future where I actually use a registration form and some other libraries for better data validation, for instance, to see that the email is actually an email, I can do one of those. So make sure you let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time. Hey there, giving a quick shout out to my patrons. Holy Coder is a member at the Progress Provider level, and Eldad is a member at the senior level. Also, thank you to all of my junior members. We're building a community, and I sincerely appreciate your continued support. You're helping me reach my goals. And if you haven't checked out my Patreon, it has exclusive content and early release content. And it's not one of those Patreons that doesn't get many posts. I'm active on there every week. I'll put a link to it in the video description, so please check it out if you haven't. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection. And a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you. And thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day. And let's write more code together very soon.